So imagine taking a completely normal, healthy child, right?
Right, just a perfectly fine toddler.
Exactly. And you feed them a harmless looking bowl of fava beans. And then, like 48 hours later, their red blood cells literally start exploding inside their veins.
It sounds like science fiction. I mean, honestly, it does.
It really does. Or, picture a toddler whose body is so starved of a specific microscopic mineral that their brain actually begins to misfire. And they are literally compelled to crawl into the driveway to eat gravel.
Yeah, or they just endlessly chew on ice from the freezer. It's wild.
It is crazy.
Yeah.
So welcome to the Duck Dive, everyone. We are super thrilled to have you with us today because to the average person, if you hear the one anemia, you probably just think, oh, they have low blood.
Right, or like they just need to eat more spinach.
Yeah, exactly. But the research we are unpacking for you today reveals this high-stakes microscopic landscape that is, well, it's so much more bizarre and complex than just eating some spinach.
It really is a fascinating world once you look closely at it. And our mission for you today is to take this massive stack of pediatric clinical data and basically decode it into a clear, usable framework.
Which is much needed, honestly.
Yeah, for sure. We're going to examine three major categories of pediatric anemias. So that's iron deficiency, megaloblastic anemias, which includes folate and vitamin B12 deficiencies, and then a genetic condition known as G6PD deficiency.
And we aren't just going to list off what these diseases are. We want to show you how they actually present on the front lines, like in a real clinic.
Exactly. We want to look at why they happen on a cellular level and the precise biochemical steps required to treat them.
So to really help you visualize what's going wrong in these three conditions, let's establish a sort of overarching analogy to keep in the back of your mind.
I love a good analogy. Let's do it.
Okay, so think of the human bone marrow as this massive, bustling manufacturing factory.
Okay, you have a factory.
And the sole purpose of this factory is to produce red blood cells, the RBCs. So in our first category, iron deficiency anemia, the factory itself is totally fine.
Right, the workers are there, the machinery's humming along.
Yeah, but there is a severe disruption in the supply chain. You simply lack the raw building materials, which is the iron, to assemble the final product.
That is like a perfectly accurate way to capture the mechanical failure of iron deficiency. It's a supply issue.
Okay, so then in our second category, the megaloblastic anemias, which involve folate and B12, the supply chain is actually fine.
Yeah, the factory has plenty of raw materials.
Right. And the master blueprint, the DNA, is completely perfect, but the copy machine used to distribute those instructions to the factory floor is completely broken.
Right, so the workers can't replicate the instructions properly.
Exactly. So production stalls on the assembly line, and you end up with these half-finished, bloated, giant cells that can't actually do their jobs.
A broken copy machine is honestly the exact right way to think about impaired DNA synthesis. Like that.
Thanks. And finally, our third category, which is G6PD deficiency. Here, the factory works flawlessly. The copy machine is fixed, the supply chain is full.
But there's a catch.
There's a huge catch. There is a critical, invisible defect in the product's armor. The cells look absolutely pristine rolling off the assembly line.
But once they leave the factory and encounter some sort of environmental threat, they lack the internal defense mechanisms to survive.
Right, and they literally shatter. So we have missing materials, a broken copy machine, and defective armor.
That's our roadmap for you today.
Yep. So before we dive under the microscope to look at, cell sizes and lab results, let's ground this in reality.
Because we are talking about real children being brought into a clinic by terrifyingly worried parents.
Terrified parents, exactly. What does this actually look like in the room? Let's start with our prototype, which is iron deficiency.
Well, to understand the scale here, iron deficiency is the most common micronutrient deficiency globally, bar none. It's everywhere.
Wow, the most common globally.
Yeah, it's the absolute prototype for what we call microcytic hypochromic anemia, which we will define mechanically in a little bit.
Right. But when we look at why it happens in kids, the sources basically break it down into three avenues.
Exactly. The first is just inadequate dietary intake. The body requires iron to synthesize hemoglobin, and if the child simply isn't eating it, the factory stalls out.
Makes total sense. And the second avenue is blood loss, which also makes intuitive sense. You lose blood, you lose the iron inside it.
Right. That could be a huge hemorrhage from a trauma, or something sneaky like occult bleeding in the gastrointestinal tract.
Occult meaning hidden, right?
Yeah, where you are losing tiny drops of blood in the stool over months, and you wouldn't even notice it happening.
But then there's the third cause listed in this clinical data, and it is just wild. Hookworm infestation.
Oh yeah, it is a massive issue, particularly in tropical and subtropical regions.
So these are literal worms.
Yeah, hookworms are parasites that live in the soil. They actually penetrate the skin, usually through bare feet.
Oh, that's horrifying.
It gets worse. They travel through the bloodstream to the lungs, they get coughed up, swallowed, and then finally anchor themselves to the lining of the small intestine.
Just hitching a ride through the whole body.
Right. And once they're in the gut, they secrete an anticoagulant so the blood doesn't clot, and they continuously siphon off the host's blood.
Wow.
Yeah, heavy infection can drain a staggering amount of systemic iron over time.
So it's basically a continuous microscopic hemorrhage happening inside the gut. So the child is losing iron, the parents bring them in. Obviously, pallor, looking pale is on the list of complaints.
Yep, pallor is always a huge red flag, and tachycardia, which is a really fast heart rate, is there too.
But the behavioral symptoms are what really stand out to me here. Extreme irritability, anorexia, which means a total loss of appetite in this context.
Right, not the eating disorder, just a complete refusal to eat.
Got it. And also a significantly shortened attention span.
That shortened attention span is a really critical detail that often gets overlooked by parents.
Why is that? Does iron affect the brain that much?
Absolutely. Iron isn't just a building block for red blood cells. It is a vital cofactor for heavily active enzymes in the brain.
Okay, so it's doing double duty.
Very much so. Specifically, iron is required to synthesize neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, and it's essential for creating myelin, which is the protective coating around our nerve fibers.
Oh, wow. So when a developing brain is starved of iron, the neurological impacts are pretty much immediate.
Exactly. It causes that intense irritability, but it also physically impairs the brain's ability to focus and process information.
Which I imagine can have long-lasting effects on cognitive development if you don't catch it and correct it.
It absolutely can. So it's definitely not just a blood issue. The entire system is experiencing this massive energy and communication crisis.
But okay, the symptom that absolutely fascinates me the most here is pica.
Oh yeah, PACE is
For
fascinating.
those listening, pica is the craving and eating of non-food items. The literature mentions children eating dirt, clay, and specifically something called pagophagia,
Pagophagia, yeah.
which is the compulsive, endless eating of ice. Why on earth, when the body is desperately lacking iron, does a child's brain suddenly decide the solution is to go eat gravel or chew on ice cubes? There is zero iron in an ice cube.
I know, it makes no logical sense.
Hmm.
It is one of the most bizarre physiological quirks we possess as humans.
Do we even know why it happens?
Well, the precise biochemical trigger for pica, and specifically pagophagia, isn't entirely mapped out perfectly yet, but we know it's a deeply wired neurological response to mineral starvation.
Okay, so how does that connect to the dirt eating?
The leading theory connects right back to those neurotransmitters we just mentioned. A lack of iron alters dopamine functioning in the brain, which heavily regulates our reward and craving pathways.
Oh, I see. So the dopamine is messed up.
Exactly. The brain registers a severe deficit of a vital mineral, the craving pathways start completely misfiring, and it triggers these primal, almost blind urges to consume earthy, mineral-like substances.
Just in a desperate attempt to find what's missing wherever it can.
Yep. It's throwing darts in the dark.
It's like the body's check engine light is on, but the dashboard computer is glitching, so it's just flashing a random message telling you to eat dirt.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it, honestly.
Yeah.
And the ice chewing, the pagophagia, that actually has its own interesting sub-theory.
Oh, really? What's the theory on the ice?
So some researchers believe that the physical act of chewing ice triggers a vascular response in the body. It supposedly diverts and increases blood flow up to the brain.
Wait, just from chewing something cold?
Yeah, and this provides a very temporary, fleeting feeling of alertness that combats the crushing fatigue and brain fog caused by the anemia. It's a compensatory habit.
Wow, so they chew ice just to stay awake.
Pretty much. And the incredible thing is, the moment you replenish their iron stores with treatment, these bizarre cravings literally vanish almost instantly.
The body is simultaneously brilliant and completely absurd. I love it. Okay, so that's the clinical picture of our factory lacking raw material.
Yep, the supply chain issue.
Let's shift over to the broken copy machine. The megaloblastic anemia is caused by folate and vitamin B12 deficiencies.
Right, these two are almost always grouped together.
They are, but looking at the clinical presentations and the sources, there are some terrifying differences between them.
Yeah, they're grouped together because they share that underlying mechanical failure. Both folate and vitamin B12 are absolutely essential for DNA synthesis.
So every time a cell divides, it has to perfectly copy its DNA.
Exactly. And without folate and B12, the copying process just stalls. The cell's cytoplasm keeps growing and maturing, waiting for the DNA to finish replicating, but it never does.
So you end up with those giant dysfunctional cells.
Right, the macrocytic cells.
Yeah.
But clinically, like you said, their fingerprints in the room are very distinct.
Let's look at folate deficiency first. The peak incidence in pediatrics is quite early, right? Usually between 4 to 7 months of age.
Yes, it hits infants hard and early.
And the common causes listed include severe malnutrition and malabsorption issues like celiac disease or giardiasis. But there's a really fascinating connection here to other blood disorders.
The hemolytic anemias.
Right. Congenital hemolytic anemias, like spherocytosis, are listed as a major cause of folate deficiency. But if spherocytosis is a disorder where red blood cells are abnormally shaped and get destroyed easily, why would that cause you to run out of folate?
It really just comes down to an issue of supply and demand. Because folate is required every single time a cell copies its DNA, it is heavily consumed during cell division.
Okay, so more cell division means less folate.
Exactly. In a condition like spherocytosis, the red blood cells are super fragile. They're constantly being destroyed by the body's immune system.
So the body has to replace them.
Right. To keep the child alive, the bone marrow has to go into massive overdrive, churning out new replacement cells at an astonishing rate.
Oh, I see.
This relentless hyperactive cell turnover acts like a massive drain on the body's folate reserves. The daily requirement for folate skyrockets far beyond what a normal diet provides.
And the child just quickly becomes deficient. The factory is working at triple speed, so it just burns through all the copy machine toner.
Exactly. It uses up all the ink. And when a child with folate deficiency is brought in, they are irritable, they aren't gaining weight, and chronic diarrhea is a massive presenting complaint.
Wait, why diarrhea? We are talking about a blood disorder.
Because the bone marrow isn't the only place in the body with rapid cell turnover. The cells lining your gastrointestinal tract divide constantly to replace themselves.
Oh, right. The stomach lining is always shedding.
Exactly. And without folate, that GI tract lining can't renew itself. The cells break down, the intestinal wall loses its ability to absorb water and nutrients, and the result is severe malabsorption and chronic diarrhea.
That makes so much sense when you look at it mechanically. Now, let's contrast that entirely with vitamin B12 deficiency.
Yeah, B12 is a whole different beast.
The text says B12 deficiency is considered much rarer because B12 is found in so many common foods. And when it does happen, the age range is way wider, peaking anywhere from 9 months to 11 years.
Yep, it takes a lot longer to develop usually.
They show up with the same severe irritability, the pallor, the extreme listlessness. But here is the massive red flag. B12 deficiency brings severe central nervous system, or CNS, involvement.
And this is where the paths of folate and B12 diverge drastically. While both are required to synthesize DNA for blood cells, B12 has a second, completely unique job.
What's the second job?
It is required for the biochemical reactions that maintain myelin. We mentioned myelin earlier. It's the fatty protective sheath that physically insulates our nerves.
Kind of like the rubber coating on a copper electrical wire.
That is the perfect analogy. Without B12, that biological rubber coating literally begins to degrade and unravel.
And the resulting symptoms from that are just chilling. The child presents with profound weakness. Paresthesia, which is that constant painful tingling or pins and needles sensation.
Yep, the nerves are misfiring.
And ataxia, which is a complete loss of physical coordination, and hyporeflexia, where their deep tendon reflexes essentially disappear completely. And in the worst cases, it leads to a coma.
It is terrifying. To really understand the ataxia, just think about your copper wire analogy. When you try to take a step, your brain sends a crisp electrical command down the nerve to your leg muscles.
Right.
If the myelin insulation is degraded, that electrical signal leaks out or it slows down drastically. The command doesn't arrive cleanly.
So it arrives like scattered and out of sync.
Exactly. The muscles fire at the wrong times and the child completely stumbles and loses all balance. It is a true medical emergency.
And there is a terrifying clinical trap here that the text points out. Let's talk about that trap because it highlights exactly why you can't just guess at diagnosis based on blood cell size.
Oh, the folate trap. Yes, this is so important. Under a microscope, the blood cells of a folate deficiency and a B12 deficiency look exactly the same.
They both have those giant, bloated, megaloblastic cells.
Right. So if a physician sees those giant cells, assumes it's a simple folate deficiency, and gives the child high doses of folate, something really disastrous happens.
What happens?
The flood of folate will actually force the DNA synthesis pathways to start working again. The bone marrow will start producing normal-sized red blood cells again.
Wait, so the anemia appears to be cured, the blood looks normal?
Yes, you fix the blood, but the B12 is still missing?
Oh no, so you've completely masked the underlying B12 starvation.
Exactly. While the doctor thinks the child is better and sends them home, the myelin degradation in the nervous system continues silently.
Wow.
By treating a B12 deficiency with folate, you allow the neurological damage to progress, potentially to the point where the ataxia and nerve death become completely permanent and irreversible.
That is wild. You fix the factory floor, but you let the electrical grid of the entire building just burn down around it.
That is exactly what happens.
Which brings us to our third category, G6PD deficiency, the defective armor. We called this a ticking time bomb in the intro, and looking at how it presents, that feels like a huge understatement.
It really is. It's classified as an episodic hemolytic anemia,
Mm.
and hemolytic meaning the explosive destruction of red blood cells.
Right, they just pop.
Yeah. G6PD stands for glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase,
Yeah.
which is an enzyme. And this condition is an X-linked recessive genetic disorder.
Okay, X-linked recessive, meaning it primarily affects males. The defective gene is carried on the X chromosome. Females have two X chromosomes, so if one is defective, they usually have a healthy backup to compensate.
Exactly. But males only have one X chromosome, so if they inherit that one defective gene, they have the disease.
And the scale of this genetic variant is absolutely staggering. It affects over 200 million people globally.
Yes, with a profoundly higher frequency among people of African, Mediterranean, and Asian ancestry.
So what makes it a time bomb? You called it stealthy.
What makes it stealthy is that between episodes, these children are entirely asymptomatic. They run, they play, they look perfectly healthy.
Because their bone marrow is producing blood, and the blood is carrying oxygen fine. The factory is running at 100% efficiency.
Exactly. Until they hit a tripwire.
And the timeline of a G6PD crisis is what makes it so frightening. The text says the symptoms don't happen immediately. The symptoms arise 48 to 96 hours after the child ingests or encounters a trigger.
Right, there's a massive delay.
So you eat something or take a medicine, 2 to 4 entire days go by, and then suddenly the bottom just falls out.
Yep. The child presents with sudden extreme pallor. Jaundice, which is the yellowing of the skin and the whites of the eyes.
And hemoglobinuria, right, meaning their urine turns dark. The notes say it sometimes resembles the color of black tea or cola.
Yeah, because it is absolutely saturated with the shattered contents of millions of destroyed red blood cells being filtered out by the kidneys.
That is so scary.
And if the trigger was potent enough, and the cell destruction is massive, they can present in a state of cardiovascular compromise.
Meaning their heart is failing.
Their heart is frantically pumping blood that suddenly has almost no red cells left in it to carry oxygen. They go into hypovolemic shock.
And that delayed onset, that 48 to 96-hour window, that is what makes diagnosing this in an emergency room so incredibly difficult, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A parent is highly unlikely to connect a sudden, life-threatening medical crash on a Friday night with a specific food the child ate for lunch on a Tuesday.
Right, you'd never put those two things together. It requires the clinician to act as an aggressive detective.
You got to dig deep into the history.
Which is a perfect transition for us because these presenting complaints don't exist in a vacuum. They are the direct result of very specific risk factors and triggers.
Right, none of this happens for no reason.
Some of these triggers are environmental, some are dietary, and some are set in motion before the child even takes their first breath. Let's look at the risk factors, starting with pregnancy and the delivery room.
Okay, so the transition from intrauterine life to the outside world is this massive physiological hurdle. And how well a baby is equipped for that jump heavily dictates their risk for anemia.
Let's look at the supply chain issue, iron first. Nature has provided a really crucial built-in fail-safe here, right?
Yes. A normal, full-term infant is born with enough stored iron in their liver to last the first 4 months of life.
It's like the mother packs them a biological backpack full of iron right before they are born.
I love that visual. That maternal transfer of iron across the placenta during the 3rd trimester is incredibly aggressive and efficient.
But that safety net is strictly temporary.
Right. Right around 4 to 6 months of age, that backpack runs completely empty. The child's blood volume is expanding rapidly as they grow, their body weight is doubling, and if they aren't transitioning to iron-rich solid foods or getting a supplement, they hit a physiological wall.
Which is exactly why the text says nutritional iron deficiency is statistically most common between 6 and 24 months of life. The internal stores are depleted, and the external diet just hasn't caught up to the massive growth demand.
Exactly. It's a timing issue.
Wait, okay, if a full-term baby gets a 4-month iron supply packed entirely during the third trimester, um, what happens to premature babies who skip that phase entirely? Are they just born at a deficit?
They absolutely are. Premature and low birth weight infants miss out on the peak window of that critical placental nutrient transfer.
So their backpack is essentially empty from day one.
Yep. And it's not just iron. Low birth weight babies are at a profoundly high risk for folate deficiency as well.
Why folate?
Because they have minimal internal stores of folate, but because they are born small, their bodies enter a state of rapid catch-up growth.
Oh, so they are growing even faster than normal babies.
Exactly. And that catch-up growth demands massive, continuous DNA synthesis, which burns through whatever tiny amounts of folate they do have incredibly fast.
So gestational age is a massive predictor for these anemias. Now, let's look at the mother's own health, specifically regarding vitamin B12. Because an exclusively breastfed infant is generally considered to be getting the perfect nutritional profile, right?
Generally, yes, but they are entirely dependent on the nutritional reality of their mother's body.
Right.
If a mother has pernicious anemia, which is an autoimmune condition that destroys a person's ability to absorb B12 from their own food, or if the mother is a strict, unsupplemented vegan with completely depleted B12 stores herself,
Then what happens to the breast milk?
her breast milk will be completely devoid of vitamin B12. There's none in there.
Wow.
And the infant, relying 100% on that milk for survival, will rapidly develop a severe deficiency, leading directly to those devastating neurological symptoms we outlined earlier.
So we have the birth constraints. Now let's walk into the dietary minefield. Because what you choose to feed a child and exactly how you prepare it dictates their cellular health in ways that are just deeply surprising in these notes.
Dietary choices are huge here.
Let's talk about folate. Human milk and cow's milk both naturally have adequate amounts of folate. But here's something that genuinely shocked me looking through this research. Goat's milk.
Ah, yes, the goat's milk issue.
It's often pitched to parents as this incredibly healthy, easily digestible alternative to cow's milk. But the text says goat's milk is practically devoid of folic acid.
It is a classic, really dangerous clinical trap. The trend of using raw or unfortified goat's milk for infants with perceived cow's milk sensitivities is highly risky.
Because there's no folate.
Right. Naturally occurring goat's milk contains almost zero folate. If an infant is fed an exclusive diet of goat's milk without aggressive vitamin supplementation, they will rapidly develop megaloblastic anemia.
It is basically a guaranteed biochemical pathway to starving the body's DNA synthesis.
It absolutely is.
And it's not just the type of food, it's the thermal physics of how you prepare it. Folate is plentiful in green leafy vegetables, right? But the research notes that simply cooking the vegetables destroys a massive percentage of the vitamin.
Yeah, folate is a highly heat-sensitive, unstable, water-soluble vitamin.
And even more surprisingly, it says boiling milk feeds can completely ruin the folate content.
Yes. The intense thermal energy of boiling literally breaks down the chemical structure of the folate molecule.
But wait, in many tropical or developing regions, boiling animal milk before giving it to an infant is an absolutely vital sanitary practice to prevent lethal bacterial infection.
Exactly. It's a brutal biological trade-off. That life-saving heat inadvertently strips the milk of its nutritional value regarding folate. You solve the immediate infectious disease problem, but you slowly create a severe nutritional deficiency problem down the line.
That is just wild. Now, for vitamin B12, the dietary risk is much more clear-cut. B12 deficiency is heavily, almost exclusively, linked to strict vegetarian and vegan diets.
That's because vitamin B12 is really unique. It is synthesized exclusively by certain microorganisms and bacteria, and in the human diet, it is found almost entirely in animal products, meat, dairy, eggs.
So plants just don't have it.
Plants do not require B12, so they do not make it or store it. A strict vegan diet, unless it is heavily and consistently supplemented with fortified foods or synthetic vitamins, will inevitably lead to a B12 deficiency over time.
Because you literally just aren't eating any.
Right. Adults might have years of B12 stored in their liver, but a growing child will deplete their tiny reserves very quickly.
And while we are talking about dietary risks and age groups, we have to mention adolescence, because teenagers hit this crazy double whammy risk factor for iron deficiency.
They really do. Adolescence is the second major explosive growth spurt of a human's life.
The first being infancy.
Right. And during adolescence, the sheer volume of blood in the body is expanding rapidly, which means the bone marrow factory is demanding huge daily shipments of iron to build millions of new red blood cells.
But for adolescent females, they are hit with high requirements for this growth spurt at the exact same time they begin experiencing routine menstrual blood loss.
It creates a massive supply and demand crisis. The physiological demand for iron is at a lifetime high, while simultaneously a significant amount of systemic iron is being routinely lost every month.
So if their diet isn't exceptionally iron-rich, they just easily and quickly slip into a microcytic anemia.
Exactly.
They
It's
don't.
incredibly common.
So we've covered the missing materials and the broken copy machines. Now we have to talk about the defective armor. The G6PD triggers.
This is where it gets really complicated.
It does, because when you look at the list of things that cause a G6PD deficient child's blood to explode, it looks like complete chaos. You have antimalarial drugs like chloroquine, you have common antibacterials like chloramphenicol, Septrin, and nitrofurantoin.
Yeah, a lot of medications.
Then it jumps to household chemicals like naphthalene, which are camphor mothballs, then food items, specifically fava beans, and finally systemic illnesses like diabetic ketoacidosis or viral hepatitis.
It is quite the list.
What is the common thread here? Why do fava beans and motorball fumes and a urinary tract antibiotic all cause the exact same explosive reaction in these red blood cells?
It absolutely looks like a random assortment of items, but to understand the common thread, we really have to go under the hood and look at what the G6PD enzyme actually does inside the cell.
Okay, let's do it.
So G6PD is a critical enzyme in something called the hexose monophosphate pathway, or the HMP pathway.
Okay, let's unpack the HMP pathway for our listeners. What exactly is that?
Think of the red blood cell as a tiny engine that runs on glucose. Most of the glucose goes down the main highway to create physical energy for the cell. But the cell diverts a small percentage of that glucose down a side street. That side street is the HMP pathway.
Okay, a little detour for the glucose.
Right. And the entire purpose of this side street is not to create energy, but to manufacture a specific defense chemical called NADPH.
NADPH. Okay, so this is the ammunition for the defense system.
Precisely. The cell uses NADPH to constantly maintain high levels of a substance called reduced glutathione.
Reduced glutathione, what does that do?
You can think of reduced glutathione as the red blood cell's internal fire extinguisher. Its only job is to cruise around the inside of the cell and put out chemical fires caused by oxidative stress.
And oxidative stress is essentially the toxic chemical exhaust that naturally builds up when a cell processes oxygen.
Right. Normal red blood cells face oxidative stress all day, every day,
Yep.
just by doing their job, and their glutathione fire extinguishers handle it easily.
But in a G6PD deficient cell,
Because that specific enzyme is missing, the HMP side street is closed off entirely. They can't make NADPH.
which means they cannot recharge their glutathione fire extinguishers, they are essentially flying without any shields.
Exactly, the defective armor. Now let's look at that chaotic list of triggers again. Fava beans, mothballs, antimalarials, severe infections. The common thread is that every single one of those specific items introduces massive, overwhelming amounts of oxidative stress into the bloodstream.
Oh, I see.
When a child takes a sulfa antibiotic like Septrin, it floods the blood with oxidative compounds. A normal red blood cell just ramps up its glutathione production and handles the drug fine.
But when those oxidative compounds enter a G6PD deficient cell, the stress goes completely unchecked. The fire just spreads instantly.
Exactly.
And what does an unchecked chemical fire actually do to the physical cell?
It attacks the physical structure of the hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the protein complex inside the cell that actually holds the oxygen. Under extreme oxidative stress, those elegant hemoglobin proteins literally denature.
Denature meaning they break down.
They unravel, they collapse, and they clump together into hard, solid masses inside the cell. And these precipitated clumps of ruined hemoglobin are called Heinz bodies.
Heinz bodies. That is a massive, highly specific diagnostic term for you all to remember.
It is very important. These hard Heinz bodies float through the cytoplasm and attach themselves to the inside of the cell membrane, making the naturally flexible red blood cell rigid and deformed.
Okay, so the cell is stiff now.
Right. And now as these deformed Heinz body-laden cells travel through the bloodstream, they eventually have to pass through the spleen. The spleen acts as the immune system's quality control filter.
And it is packed with macrophages.
Yes, macrophages, which basically act like aggressive bouncers.
And the bouncers see the deformed cell.
The macrophages recognize that the cell is damaged. They latch onto the cell membrane, and they literally take a physical bite out of the cell to remove the hard Heinz body.
They bite the cell.
Literally. And in doing so, they completely shred the integrity of the cell membrane. The cell can't survive the damage, and it undergoes sudden hemolysis. It pops.
That is a staggering, violent, microscopic visual. The cell absorbs mothball fumes, the internal fire extinguisher fails, the oxygen proteins melt into Heinz bodies, and then the spleen's bouncers just rip the cell to pieces.
That is exactly the sequence of events.
And because this is happening to millions of cells simultaneously across the entire body, the child suddenly turns yellow and pees dark brown 48 hours later as the kidneys and liver try to clear out the millions of shattered cell fragments.
Exactly. When you understand the biochemical mechanics of the HMP pathway and oxidative stress, that totally random list of triggers suddenly transforms into a highly logical, predictable map of chemical threats.
It really does. Okay, so we have the dietary missteps, the bizarre ice cravings, the invisible chemical tripwires. The parents have brought the child to the clinic. Now, what happens in the room?
The physical examination.
Yes, we transition to the detective work. What does the doctor actually see and hear when this child is sitting on the exam table? Because we have shared findings across all anemias and then highly specific clues for each type.
Right, so the shared findings are simply the body's generalized systemic panic response to not having enough oxygen carrying capacity.
It doesn't matter what kind of anemia it is.
It's exactly. Regardless of whether the factory lacks iron, has a broken copy machine, or is producing defective armor, the end result is a lack of functional red blood cells. The child is going to be pale. The mucous membranes inside the mouth, the conjunctiva of the eyes, the creases in the palms of the hands, they all lose that healthy pink vascular hue.
And tachycardia, the heart rate spikes.
Yes. Think about the fluid dynamics here.
Yeah.
The blood is quite literally thin because it lacks the dense mass of hemoglobin and red blood cells.
So it's watery.
Very watery. The body detects that tissues aren't getting enough oxygen. So the brain tells the heart to compensate by pumping that thin, watery blood much, much faster to deliver the required amount of oxygen over the same period of time.
It's like an engine forced to redline constantly just to maintain highway speed.
Perfect analogy.
But the real diagnostic power lies in the specific clues. Let's look at the physical findings unique to iron deficiency. The notes say you listen to the heart with a stethoscope and you hear a systolic murmur, and the heart itself shows cardiac dilatation.
That is a direct mechanical result of that high-revving engine we just talked about. Because the blood is less viscous, more watery, as it gets pumped furiously through the tight valves of the heart, it creates a turbulent rushing flow rather than a smooth flow.
So it's a sound issue.
Right. That turbulence is what we hear through the stethoscope as a systolic murmur. And over months or years, the sheer physical strain of constantly pumping at maximum output causes the heart muscle itself to stretch, weaken, and dilate. That's cardiac dilatation.
We also see splenic enlargement in a percentage of these patients. But here's the physical finding that is truly haunting to me. For long-standing severe chronic iron deficiency cases, a physical exam might reveal koilonychia.
Koilonychia, yes. Spoon-shaped nails.
How does a lack of iron in the bloodstream cause a child's fingernails to physically cave in on themselves and look like spoons?
It is a profound visual testament to how deeply a lack of basic raw materials compromises the body's structural integrity. Fingernails are composed of a tough protein called keratin.
Right, keratin.
The specialized cells at the base of your nail, the nail matrix, produce this keratin. But to function properly and to build the strong crosslinks that give a nail its rigid upward curving architecture, those cells require specific iron-dependent enzymes.
Oh, I see. So without iron, the enzymes fail, and the keratin is essentially built with cheap, weak mortar.
Exactly. When iron is profoundly deficient for an extended period, the new nail tissue being formed is fundamentally weak and fragile. The natural convex, upward curvature of the nail collapses under everyday pressure.
It just sinks in.
The central portion of the nail plate actually depresses and sinks inward, creating a concave, spoon-like shape that is so pronounced it can literally hold a drop of water.
Wow. The factory is so utterly starved for materials that the physical external architecture of the body is actually warping.
It really is incredible to see.
Now let's contrast that with the physical signs of the megaloblastic anemias. There is a very specific and agonizingly painful physical sign for vitamin B12 deficiency, glossitis.
Glossitis is awful. It's a tongue that is bright red, completely smooth, and intensely painful.
What's the mechanism there?
The mechanism here is very similar to why folate deficiency causes severe diarrhea. The papillae, On the surface of the tongue, the tiny textured bumps that contain your taste buds, they have an exceptionally high rate of cellular turnover.
Because they get worn out from eating.
Exactly. They're constantly subjected to friction, heat, and food, so they need to divide and regenerate constantly to maintain the tongue's protective surface.
And regeneration requires DNA synthesis, which requires B12 and folate.
Right. Without B12 or folate to power the copy machine, these cells simply cannot replicate. The old cells die off, and no new cells replace them. The papillae completely atrophy and slough off.
So the tongue just loses all its texture.
The tongue loses all of its protective texture, leaving it completely smooth, beefy red, raw, and incredibly inflamed.
It's so striking to me. You have this very visceral, visible, agonizing physical sign, the bright red smooth tongue, while simultaneously, deep inside the body, the exact same B12 deficiency is silently destroying the myelin sheath of the spinal cord.
Causing the ataxia and nerve death?
Yeah, the visible and the invisible happening at exactly the same time.
It's a stark reminder that what you see on a physical exam is often just the surface manifestation of massive systemic cellular chaos.
And finally, the specific physical presentation of a G6PD crisis. So the child has hit a trigger, and they are in the middle of a hemolytic episode.
The physical signs are explosive. Sudden, profound pallor as millions of red cells are shattered. But the defining physical sign is acute jaundice.
Which comes down to how the body cleans up the wreckage of those destroyed cells, right?
Exactly. As the spleen's bouncers pop those millions of Heinz body-filled red blood cells, massive quantities of raw hemoglobin are spilled directly into the bloodstream.
And the body has to clear it out.
Right. The body's cleanup crew breaks that hemoglobin down into a byproduct called bilirubin, which is a vivid yellow pigment. Normally, the liver easily processes bilirubin and excretes it in bile.
But during a crisis...
During a G6PD crisis, the sheer volume of bilirubin flooding the system completely overwhelms the liver's capacity. The yellow pigment backs up into the bloodstream, saturates the tissues, and physically deposits in the skin and the sclera, which are the whites of the eyes, turning them bright yellow.
There is a terrifying warning in the text here regarding newborns, though. Severe neonatal jaundice in an infant with G6PD deficiency is classified as a massive medical emergency, often requiring an exchange blood transfusion.
It is a critical emergency, yes.
Why is it so much more dangerous in a newborn?
It comes down to the immaturity of a newborn's biology. First, a newborn's liver is barely functioning at full capacity yet, so it gets overwhelmed by bilirubin much faster than an older child's liver.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second, and far more dangerously, a newborn's blood-brain barrier, which is the biological shield that protects the brain from toxins in the blood, is incredibly porous and immature.
Oh no, so the bilirubin can cross over.
Yes. If a G6PD deficient newborn is exposed to a trigger, perhaps through the mother's diet if she ate fava beans while breastfeeding, or via a medication given at the hospital, the resulting weight of hemolysis creates a massive spike in bilirubin.
And it gets into the brain.
Because the blood-brain barrier is weak, that toxic yellow bilirubin physically crosses into the brain tissue and deposits in the basal ganglia.
What does that do?
This causes a condition known as kernicterus. It is permanent, devastating, irreversible brain damage, or even death.
Oh my goodness.
If those bilirubin levels spike too rapidly, the only option to save the brain is an exchange blood transfusion, where the clinical team slowly drains the infant's toxic, bilirubin-laden blood and simultaneously replaces it with fresh, healthy donor blood.
That is the stakes could not be higher.
They really couldn't.
The physical exam is intense. The spoon nails, the smooth tongue, the sudden jaundice, they're all brilliant clues. But clues alone aren't enough to formulate a lifelong treatment plan. That brings us to the next phase, investigations and labs.
Yes, we are moving from the exam room to under the microscope.
Right. If the physical exam provides the suspicion, the laboratory provides the absolute conviction.
The laboratory is where the fog clears. It is where we definitively categorize these anemias. And the primary tool, the compass we use to navigate this landscape, is the MCV.
The mean corpuscular volume. This is a measurement of the physical size of the red blood cells.
Precisely. It measures the average volume of a single red blood cell in femtoliters. We use the MCV to instantly divide these blood disorders into three distinct diagnostic buckets: microcytic, macrocytic, and normocytic.
Okay, let's explore the microcytic bucket first. Micro, meaning small. This is our iron deficiency prototype. The lab report states the cells are microcytic and hypochromic. They have a low MCV, a low MCH, and a low MCHC. What do all those acronyms actually tell us about the physical state of the cell?
Well, MCH stands for mean corpuscular hemoglobin, which is the absolute physical weight of the hemoglobin inside a single cell. MCHC is the mean corpuscular hemoglobin concentration, which is the percentage of the cell's volume that is taken up by hemoglobin.
And hemoglobin is the dense, iron-rich protein that physically gives blood its deep red color.
Exactly. In iron deficiency, the factory has no iron to build hemoglobin. So the resulting cells are physically tiny, which is low MCV. They contain very little hemoglobin weight, which is low MCH.
And because they lack that dense red protein, they look completely pale and washed out under the microscope, which is low MCHC.
Right, that's what hypochromic means, lacking color. Tiny and pale.
Tiny and pale. Got it. Now, the lab also runs an iron panel, and it gives us 4 distinct values: serum ferritin, serum iron, transferrin, and TIBC, which is total iron binding capacity.
It's a lot of alphabet soup, I know.
It is. I want to build a visual analogy to make sense of this alphabet soup for you guys, because understanding how these numbers relate is the key to the diagnosis. Let's imagine that transferrin is a massive fleet of transport buses.
Oh, okay, transport bus. I love that analogy. Transferrin is the dedicated transport protein.
Okay, so their only job is to drive around the bloodstream, pick up iron passengers from the gut, and deliver them to the bone marrow factory.
Perfect.
So serum ferritin represents the total amount of iron securely stored in the liver's warehouse. In iron deficiency, the warehouse is completely empty, so serum ferritin is low.
Right.
Serum iron represents the actual number of iron passengers currently riding on the buses. Since there's no iron in the diet, serum iron is also low.
Also correct.
But then we have TIBC, the total iron binding capacity, and the lab says this number is high. If transferrin is the bus fleet, TIBC is essentially measuring how many empty seats are available on those buses.
Yes, that logic tracks perfectly. The body systems are highly reactive. The liver senses that the bone marrow is starving for iron.
So what does it do?
In a state of total panic, the liver starts mass-producing millions of new transferrin buses and pumps them directly into the bloodstream, desperately hoping to catch any stray molecule of iron that might enter the body.
Oh, wow.
Because there is absolutely no iron to be found, you end up with a massive fleet of buses circling the bloodstream, and almost every single seat is empty.
So the capacity to bind iron, the number of seats, is extremely high, but the actual iron bound is practically zero.
Exactly. A high TIBC combined with a low serum ferritin is the absolute classic, undeniable laboratory signature of iron deficiency.
I just love when the mechanics are that elegant.
It makes diagnosing it very clear.
Let's move to the second bucket on the MCV map, macrocytic. Macro, meaning large. This is our folate and B12 group. The lab says the MCV is greater than 100 femtoliters. The cells are giant.
Because the copy machine is broken, DNA synthesis is stalled. The cell physically cannot divide to form 2 normal-sized daughter cells.
So it just sits there.
Yeah, it just sits there. Its cytoplasm swelling and growing larger and larger, resulting in a giant, clumsy, macrocytic cell.
The lab report mentions a really fascinating detail about what the bone marrow looks like in this state. It describes the marrow as hypercellular with an asynchrony between nuclear and cytoplasmic maturation. What does that chaos actually look like?
It looks like a factory that has completely lost its mind. The body knows it's anemic, so it screams at the bone marrow to work harder. The marrow responds by becoming hypercellular. It is absolutely jam-packed with precursor cells trying to become red blood cells.
Okay, so there's a ton of activity.
But when you zoom in on an individual cell on the assembly line, you see the asynchrony. The cytoplasm of the cell is maturing rapidly and growing huge, but the nucleus, which houses the DNA, looks tiny, primitive, and stunted because it physically cannot replicate its code.
The chassis of the car is fully built, but the engine is only half assembled.
Exactly. And the lab gives us a massive red flag to look for on the peripheral blood smear here. Hypersegmented neutrophils.
Wait, neutrophils are a type of white blood cell, right? Part of the immune system.
Yep.
Why are they affected by a red blood cell problem?
Because the broken copy machine affects every cell in the body that needs to divide. White blood cells need to synthesize DNA just like red blood cells do.
Oh, of course.
A normal, healthy neutrophil has a nucleus that is neatly divided into 3 or 4 lobes. But without folate or B12 to guide proper DNA replication, the nucleus of these immune cells becomes chaotic and hypersegmented.
Meaning they have too many lobes?
Right, breaking into 5, 6, or even 7 distinct lobes. Seeing hypersegmented white blood cells on a smear is an instant screaming indicator that you are dealing with a megaloblastic process.
The lab also shows highly elevated levels of an enzyme called LDH, lactate dehydrogenase. Why is that spiking?
Because those giant, bloated, poorly constructed macrocytic cells are incredibly fragile. They are defective products.
So they break easily.
Many of them simply break apart and die right there inside the bone marrow before they are even released into the bloodstream. When they pop, they spill all their internal cellular contents, including massive amounts of the enzyme LDH, directly into the serum.
So the lab results for folate and B12 deficiency look practically identical. Giant cells, hypersegmented white blood cells, high LDH.
They look very similar, yes.
The only way to definitively tell them apart is to run specific serum levels, right? If folate is below 3 nanograms per deciliter, it's folate. If B12 is low, it's B12.
True, but there is one subtle, specific finding for B12 on the slide: macroovulocytosis.
What's that?
While both deficiencies create massive cells, B12 deficiency specifically tends to produce giant red blood cells that are distinctly oval or egg-shaped rather than perfectly round. It's a subtle architectural clue that points the hematologist toward B12.
Okay, I want to jump back to iron deficiency for just a second because I skipped over a finding in the radiology section that is genuinely shocking to me.
Oh, the skull x-rays.
Yes. Under radiological findings for severe, long-standing iron deficiency, it lists widening of the diploe of the skull. We touched on the marrow expanding earlier, but I want to understand the physics of this. How does a lack of microscopic iron in the blood physically alter the bones of a child's skull?
It is a profound demonstration of the body's desperate drive to survive hypoxia, which is a lack of oxygen. The bone marrow inside the cavities of your bones is the only place red blood cells are manufactured.
Right.
In chronic, severe iron deficiency, the body is drowning. The tissues are starving for oxygen. The kidneys sense this hypoxia and release a hormone called erythropoietin, which floods the bone marrow, essentially screaming at the factory to produce more blood immediately.
But the factory has no iron to build the blood.
Right, but it tries anyway. The bone marrow goes into massive, uncontrolled overdrive. It expands its production lines, creating millions of useless, half-empty cells.
Okay, so it swells up.
In young children, the bones of the skull are still relatively soft, pliable, and growing. The physical mass of the hyperactive bone marrow tissue expands so aggressively and with such a relentless hydraulic force that it physically pushes the inner and outer tables of the skull bones apart.
It inflates the bone from the inside out. That is insane.
Exactly. On an X-ray, this looks like a massively widened space within the skull bone itself, the widened diploic space. In the most extreme, untreated cases, the expanding marrow tissue can actually erupt vertically through the outer layer of the bone.
Oh my God.
Yeah, creating a horrific, bristling, hair-on-end appearance on the X-ray. It is a massive, permanent structural deformity of the skeleton caused entirely by the absence of a simple dietary mineral.
That is unforgettable, the body warping its own skeleton trying to find a breath of air.
It's a very powerful image.
All right, let's move to our final diagnostic bucket. Normocytic. Normo, meaning normal size. This is the G6PD deficiency. The lab report states the RBC indices, the size and hemoglobin weight, are perfectly normal. But the cells have a severely shortened lifespan. Normal is 100 to 120 days.
If you draw blood from a child with G6PD deficiency on a random Tuesday, when they are healthy and haven't encountered a trigger, the lab results will look utterly unremarkable.
So the MCV is perfect, the MCH is perfect, the factory is working perfectly, and the blueprints are fine.
Exactly.
But during an attack 48 hours after they eat the faba beans, the lab goes completely wild. We already talked about the Heinz bodies, the clumps of melted hemoglobin, and the spherocytes, the rigid deformed cells created after the spleen's bouncers take a bite out of them.
Yes.
But here's the golden pearl of this entire clinical review. This is the detail that prevents a catastrophic misdiagnosis. The text explicitly, aggressively warns, do not test G6PD enzyme activity immediately after a hemolytic episode.
It is a huge trap.
I want you to walk us through the mechanics of why a doctor must wait, because the logic here is brilliant.
It is brilliant, and it's a trap that catches a lot of junior clinicians. Think about the population of red blood cells in the child's body as a society with different generations.
Okay, a society of cells.
You have the elderly cells that have been circulating for 100 days, and the infant cells, the reticulocytes, that just left the bone marrow yesterday.
Got it.
In G6PD deficiency, specifically the African A variant, which affects up to 20% of the population in some regions, the enzyme deficiency is primarily an issue of instability.
What does that mean, instability?
It means the G6PD enzyme physically degrades and disappears as the cell ages.
Okay, so the brand new young cells have almost normal enzyme levels, but the old 100-day-old cells have absolutely zero.
Exactly. Now, an oxidative trigger is introduced. Say the child is given a sulfa antibiotic. That massive wave of oxidative stress acts like a predator that only attacks the weakest members of the herd.
But so targets the old cells.
It completely, utterly destroys all the old enzyme-deficient red blood cells. They pop, and their remains are cleared away by the liver and spleen,
Leaving only the young cells.
leaving only the young, robust cells, which still have near-normal levels of the enzyme.
Oh, wow.
If you draw blood right now, right in the middle of the crisis, and you run a test to measure G6PD enzyme activity, the machine will analyze those surviving young cells and return a result saying enzyme levels are completely normal.
You will get a false negative.
You will confidently tell the parents the child does not have G6PD deficiency, and you will send them back out into the world to be given that exact same triggering antibiotic again.
That is a terrifying clinical trap. The crisis literally hides the evidence of the disease.
It does. You are sampling the survivors, not the victims. To get an accurate diagnosis, you must defer the enzyme assay.
So you just have to wait.
You stabilize the child, let the crisis pass, and wait several weeks. You have to wait for the bone marrow to calm down, for the flood of young reticulocytes to drop, and for a normal, mixed-age society of red blood cells to naturally reestablish itself.
And then you test.
Only then will the blood test accurately reveal the underlying systemic enzyme deficiency.
It's all about understanding the lifespan and timeline of the cell, which brings us perfectly to segment 5, treatment and the why behind it.
Yes, the best part, how to fix it.
We have identified the mechanical failures. Now, how do we fix the factory? The treatment protocols aren't just about handing the parents a generic pill. They are meticulously calculated biochemical replenishment strategies based on the specific mechanical breakdown.
They have to be specific.
Let's start with treating the prototype iron deficiency.
The core treatment is wonderfully straightforward. Oral elemental iron. The standard protocol calls for a dose of 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight per day, usually divided into 3 doses to maximize absorption.
And there are incredibly specific instructions on how to take it. It says it is best given between meals and aided by vitamin C. Why between meals? And what does vitamin C have to do with iron?
The absorption of iron in the small intestine is highly sensitive to the chemical environment of the gut. If you take iron with a large meal, the iron molecules will bind to other compounds in the food, specifically things like phytates in grains or tannins in tea.
And that creates insoluble complexes that the gut cannot absorb.
Exactly. Taking it between meals ensures the iron has a clear path to the intestinal wall.
Then the vitamin C.
Vitamin C, or ascorbic acid, acts as a chemical reducing agent. It forcefully keeps the iron in its ferrous state, which is the specific chemical structure that the cells of the intestine can most easily absorb. It's a biochemical booster.
But the instructions also carry a strict warning. Large amounts consumption of milk is best avoided. We know milk doesn't contain iron, but does it actively sabotage the treatment?
It absolutely does. The calcium in cow's milk physically competes with iron for the exact same absorption receptors in the gut wall.
Wow, they fight for the same door?
Yes. If a parent gives their child an iron supplement and washes it down with a glass of milk, the calcium crowds out the iron, significantly reducing the amount of iron that actually makes it into the bloodstream.
Okay, so that's the standard oral route, but what about an emergency?
Like heart failure.
Yeah, a child comes in with extreme chronic anemia causing full-blown congestive heart failure. The heart is just exhausted from pumping that thin, watery blood for months.
It's a very delicate situation.
The protocol dictates an immediate blood transfusion, packed red cells at 10 milliliters per kilogram. But it also mandates giving an IV injection of a drug called furosemide at 1 to 2 milliliters per kilogram at the exact same time.
Furosemide, yes.
Wait, if a child's heart is failing, why are you giving them a powerful diuretic, a drug that forces the kidneys to make urine right in the middle of a blood transfusion?
It seems entirely contradictory, I know. But it is a critical life-saving fluid dynamics calculation. Remember the physical state of this child's heart.
Right.
It is dilated, stretched out, and incredibly weak from months of overwork.
Yeah.
If you suddenly hook them up to an IV and pump a large volume of dense, heavy, packed red blood cells directly into their veins, you are drastically increasing the volume and the viscosity of their blood in a matter of minutes.
The weak factory equipment can't handle a sudden, massive delivery of heavy materials.
Precisely.
Hmm.
That sudden surge in fluid pressure will overwhelm the weakened heart muscle, throwing the child into acute congestive heart failure and causing pulmonary edema, where fluid backs up into the lungs.
And the furosemide stops that.
Furosemide is a potent, fast-acting diuretic. By injecting it concurrently with the dense blood transfusion, you force the kidneys to rapidly excrete the patient's existing watery plasma volume.
Oh.
You're essentially draining the watery fluid out of the circulatory system at the exact same rate you are pumping the heavy red blood cells in. It creates space, preventing a catastrophic pressure overload on the failing heart.
That is just brilliant medical plumbing. Now, assuming we avoid the emergency room and treat the standard way, with oral iron drops, there is this incredible day-by-day recovery timeline that shows exactly how the human machine reboots itself.
I love walking through this timeline.
Let's do it. Okay, 12 to 24 hours after taking the first dose of iron. The timeline says subjective improvement, decreased irritability, increased appetite. Wait, the mood and the appetite improve before the blood even changes. Why?
Because the body prioritizes the most critical systems first. The very first molecules of absorbed iron bypass the bone marrow entirely. They are shipped straight to the brain and the central nervous system to replenish those critical intracellular enzymes we discussed earlier.
The dopamine pathways stabilize.
Exactly. The neurological misfiring stops, the pica cravings vanish, and the child's mood dramatically improves within a single day.
The check engine light turns off instantly. Okay, 36 to 48 hours. Initial bone marrow response, erythroid hyperplasia.
The first wave of iron has finally reached the factory floor. The raw materials are dumped on the assembly line and the bone marrow kicks into high gear, rapidly expanding its production lines now that it actually has what it needs to finish the product.
48 to 72 hours. Reticulocytosis, which peaks at 5-7 days.
Reticulocytes are the brand new baby red blood cells. This is the triumphant moment the factory doors swing open and a massive, healthy wave of millions of new iron-rich red blood cells floods into the bloodstream.
4 to 30 days, increase in hemoglobin levels. It takes up to a month for the actual blood test to show a higher hemoglobin number.
Right, because it takes time for those daily waves of new cells to accumulate and raise the overall mathematical concentration of hemoglobin in the entire circulating blood volume.
And finally, 1 to 3 months. Repletion of iron stores. The protocols heavily, aggressively emphasize that treatment must continue for this entire period.
This is the single biggest area of treatment failure.
Why do people fail here?
Well, the child feels amazing on day 2. Their blood test looks perfectly normal on day 30, so the parents naturally stop giving the nasty-tasting iron supplement.
But if you stop at day 30, the factory is working, but the warehouse, the liver's ferritin stores, is still completely empty.
Exactly. The moment that child hits a minor growth spurt or gets a common cold, they will immediately burn through their circulating iron and relapse right back into anemia. You must continue the daily treatment for months to fill that biological backpack back up.
You have to rebuild the reserves. Okay, let's look at treating the broken copy machines, the megaloblastic anemias.
The folate and B12 group.
For folate deficiency, it's oral or parenteral administration at 5-10 millicrelate a day, and it highlights the importance of prophylaxis, preventative, proactive treatment for high-risk groups.
Yes. You don't wait for certain patients to become deficient. Low birth weight babies, patients with chronic hemolysis like spherocytosis or sickle cell, and notably patients taking antifolic drugs like methotrexate.
Methotrexate blocks folate.
Methotrexate works by intentionally blocking the body's use of folate to stop rapidly dividing cancer cells or severe autoimmune diseases. But it also stops red blood cell production. So you must supplement them proactively to bypass the blockade.
But the treatment for vitamin B12 deficiency is drastically different, and it carries a much heavier, permanent reality. The protocol dictates that B12 deficiency requires a parenteral, meaning intramuscular, loading dose of 1 milligram.
Yes, an injection.
And if there is neurological involvement, if they have that ataxia or tingling, they get a painful injection deep into the muscle every single day for 2 weeks. But here's the heavy part. Maintenance therapy is continued throughout life.
It is a lifelong commitment.
Wait. If they're just deficient in B12, why can't they just swallow a B12 vitamin every morning with breakfast the same way you do with iron or folate? Why must it be an injection?
It all comes down to the bizarre, incredibly highly specific biological pathway required to absorb vitamin B12. B12 is a massive, complex molecule. It physically cannot be absorbed through the gut wall on its own.
It's too big.
It needs help.
Yeah.
When you swallow B12 in food or a pill, it travels to the stomach. There, specialized cells in the stomach lining, called parietal cells, must secrete a unique transport protein called intrinsic factor.
Intrinsic factor. Okay.
The intrinsic factor binds tightly to the B12 molecule, creating a locked complex. This complex then has to travel the entire length of the gastrointestinal tract, all the way to the very end of the small intestine, a section called the terminal ileum.
It has to go all the way to the end.
Only there, at the very end, and only if the B12 is securely bound to intrinsic factor, will the cellular doors open to allow the B12 into the bloodstream.
It requires a highly specific biological escort, and it has to travel to a highly specific door.
Exactly. Now, look closely at the causes of B12 deficiency we discussed earlier. Lack of secretion of intrinsic factor, which is the autoimmune disease pernicious anemia, or surgeries involving the removal of the stomach or the terminal ileum.
Oh, I see where this is going.
If a child's immune system has destroyed the parietal cells, they produce no intrinsic factor. Or if their terminal ileum is damaged by disease or surgery.
In either case, their GI tract is effectively sealed off, the biological escort is missing, or the specific door is bricked over.
Exactly. You could feed that child a massive bucket of oral B12 pills every day, and it would pass straight through their digestive system and into the toilet without a single molecule ever entering their blood.
The oral route is completely permanently broken.
Right. The absolute only way to bypass that broken digestive pathway is to inject the B12 directly into the muscle tissue, forcing it straight into the vascular system.
Wow.
And because the stomach lining or the terminal ileum isn't going to magically heal or regrow, that child will require those intramuscular injections for the rest of their natural life just to prevent their myelin sheaths from degrading and causing irreversible nerve death.
That is a stark, heavy clinical reality to deliver to a family.
It's one of the hardest conversations a pediatrician has to have.
Okay, finally, managing our third category, G6PD deficiency. How do you fix the defective armor?
You don't.
You don't.
No, you cannot fix a genetic enzyme deficiency. The core management strategy is purely preventative. Complete, total, uncompromising avoidance of precipitating agents.
So you just keep them away from the triggers.
You give the family a detailed list. No fava beans under any circumstances. Throw out the camphor mothballs, and you flag their medical charts so they are never prescribed specific trigger antibiotics or antimalarials.
And if they do accidentally get exposed and they enter a hemolytic crisis with massive jaundice and dark urine,
But it becomes purely supportive care. You hydrate them aggressively to protect the kidneys from all the destroyed cell fragments.
and you mentioned transfusions earlier.
Red blood cell transfusions are used only if the hemolysis is so severe that they show symptoms of cardiovascular shock. However, there's a strangely reassuring mechanical reality regarding the African A variant of G6PD.
Oh, really? What's that?
Because the enzyme degrades naturally as the cell ages, the brand new young erythrocytes that the bone marrow frantically pumps out to replace the destroyed ones actually possess enough G6PD activity to survive the oxidative stress.
Oh, so the wave of destruction essentially hits a biological wall?
Yes, the old weak cells are violently purged, but the young strong cells survive the chemical trigger. So the hemolytic process is often self-limiting. The mass destruction stops on its own, even if the triggering drug is still in their system.
That is incredible. We have covered an immense amount of microscopic ground for you today.
We really have.
As we near the end of this deep dive, I want to synthesize this. If you are a physician in a chaotic, loud pediatric emergency room, how do you keep these straight? Can we build a clean, logical decision tree based on all this biochemical machinery?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The clinical data provides a beautifully logical map if you step back and look at the whole picture. Let's walk through the decision tree.
Okay, let's do it.
A pale, highly irritable child is brought into your exam room. The very first branch on the diagnostic tree is always the MCV lab result. You look at the physical size of the red blood cells.
Okay, branch 1. The MCV is very low. The cells are microcytic and pale.
If the cells are small and empty, you immediately think iron deficiency. The factory lacks raw materials. You step back and look for the clinical context. Did the parents feed them too much cow's milk without transitioning to solid foods? Are they a menstruating adolescent?
You look at their fingernails for the concave spoon shape of koilonychia.
To confirm, you run the iron panel. If the serum ferritin in the warehouse is low, but the TIBC, the empty transfer in bus seats, is screaming high, you have your definitive diagnosis.
You treat with oral elemental iron, aided by vitamin C, and you enforce compliance for 3 to 4 months to rebuild the liver's biological backpack.
Perfect. Okay, back to the start. Branch 2. The MCV is high. The cells are giant, bloated, and macrocytic.
If the cells are giant, you have a broken copy machine. You think megaloblastic anemia, folate, or B12.
Now, you must carefully differentiate, because making a mistake here causes permanent nerve damage. You examine the child's mouth. If they have glossitis, that bright red, smooth, intensely painful tongue.
Or if they show any hint of urological signs like ataxia, stumbling, or altered reflexes.
You immediately suspect B12 deficiency. You check the dietary history. Are they a strict, unsupplemented vegan? You confirm with a low serum B12 level, and you treat with lifelong intramuscular B12 injections.
And what if there are absolutely no neurological signs, but the parents mention they've been feeding the infant unfortified goat's milk or heavily boiling their milk feeds?
Then you strongly suspect folate deficiency. You confirm with a serum folate level below 3 nanograms per deciliter, and you treat with simple oral folate supplementation.
Brilliant. Okay, back at the start. Branch 3. The MCV is perfectly normal. The cells are a normal size and weight. But the child is intensely pale, suddenly jaundiced, peeing dark urine, and their reticulocyte count, the baby replacement cells, is skyrocketing.
A normal MCV but a massive reticulocyte count means the factory is working perfectly, but the finished products are being violently destroyed after they leave the facility. It is a hemolytic process.
So if the child has a clinical history of suddenly developing these explosive symptoms 48 to 96 hours after being given a sulfa antibiotic for an infection, or eating fava beans, you suspect G6PD deficiency.
You look at the blood smear for the rigid Heinz bodies and the bitten spherocytes. And crucially, you remember the trap. You do not test the enzyme level today.
Right, because of the false negative. You provide supportive care, wait for the crisis to pass and the cell population to age naturally, and test them weeks later to confirm the defective armor.
It is so incredibly satisfying to see how logically and perfectly the diagnostic process flows when you truly understand the underlying cellular machinery.
This research doesn't just list medical facts, it lays out a dynamic, reactive biological map. Thank you to everyone for joining us on this intensely detailed exploration today.
We covered a lot.
We really did. We have traversed from the behavioral mysteries of dopamine and ice cravings to the thermal destruction of vitamins in boiled milk, all the way to hypersegmented immune cells, bone marrow expansion that warps the skull, and the precise day-by-day biochemical reboot of the human blood supply.
It really is a profound journey into how delicate yet relentlessly resilient the human machine is. But before we sign off today, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder.
Oh, I love these.
Something that builds on this clinical data, but points to a much grander ancient mystery. Consider the fascinating evolutionary trade-offs written into our biology. The research clearly notes that G6PD deficiency, along with inherited hemoglobinopathies like sickle cell trait, are incredibly common in tropical and subtropical regions.
G6PD deficiency alone affects over 200 million people worldwide.
Exactly. That is a massive, staggering percentage of the global human population walking around carrying a genetic defect.
Right. From a purely mechanical, clinical standpoint, these are genetic defects. They make the red blood cells fragile, defective, and highly prone to violent destruction.
But the brutal math of evolution doesn't usually preserve and multiply traits that are purely harmful across hundreds of millions of people for thousands of years.
Oh, wow. I see what you mean.
These specific enzyme and hemoglobin defects persist in these exact populations because they likely offered a profound, life-saving survival advantage against one of the greatest ancient threats in those tropical environments, malaria.
The malaria parasite targets the blood, right?
Yes, the malaria parasite infects humans and requires a highly stable, healthy, long-lasting red blood cell in order to replicate and spread.
So if a red blood cell has defective G6PD deficient armor,
And it violently explodes at the very first sign of oxidative stress caused by the parasite's entry. The parasite's home is destroyed before it can reproduce.
yeah,
The parasite dies with the cell.
the genetic defect that causes the terrifying anemia is the exact same mechanism that prevents death from malaria.
The vulnerability is actually the shield.
That is amazing.
It makes you wonder, as we look at all these incredibly complex microscopic breakdowns, from misfiring immune systems to strange genetic variants to bizarre dietary cravings.
How many of our modern biological vulnerabilities are actually the lingering echoes of our ancestors' greatest, most desperate survival mechanisms? That is an incredible thought to end on. The murky, chaotic waters of a medical diagnosis are often just the visible ripples of a much deeper, ancient evolutionary story. We invite you to keep questioning the world around you, keep looking past the surface to find the hidden mechanics, keep learning, and join us next time for another deep dive.